The winter that changed everything northwestern Kansas. January 1886. The temperature had been dropping since before Christmas, and by the second week of the new year, it hadn't climbed above 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius for 11 consecutive days. Local oral accounts described that stretch as the killing cold, a phrase that wasn't metaphor. It was inventory, livestock, neighbors, old men who ran out of firewood on a Wednesday and weren't found until Saturday. In a small settlement along the dry fork of the Saline River, roughly 40 miles from the nearest town with a hardware store, the cabins sat low and dark against the white. Most of them burned through a cord of split oak every 10 days. Most of them had frost on the inside of the walls by morning. Most of them were held together by hope, tar paper, and the collective stubbornness of people who had come too far to go back. And then there was Elias Warren's place. From a road, if you could call a frozen wagon rut a road, it didn't look like much. Walls that seemed too thick, a roofline that sat strangely low, and wrapped around the entire structure, stacked in tight, rectangular bundles from ground to eave, what appeared to be bales of straw. "Looks like a hay barn with windows," one neighbor said. "Looks like something a man builds when he's given up," said another. By late February, those same neighbors would be standing at Elias's door, not to mock him, to measure. If you've ever wondered why the old ways of building kept people alive when modern methods would have failed them, subscribe right now. Every week, we dig into real frontier engineering, the techniques that weren't taught in schools, the solutions that were laughed at until lives depended on them. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Because this story belongs to anyone who's ever faced a winter and had to think harder than their budget allowed. Standard walls, standard failure to understand why Elias Warren did what he did. You have to understand what everyone else was doing and why it wasn't working. The standard settler cabin in northwestern Kansas in the 1880s was built from whatever material was fastest to assemble and cheapest to acquire. In the eastern states, that meant timber framing and clapboard siding. On the open prairie, timber was scarce and expensive, hauled in by rail and sold by the board foot at prices that made grown men wince. So most settlers built with what the land offered: sod bricks cut from the root-dense prairie turf, or thin-walled frame construction covered in a single layer of pine board and a strip of tar paper that was more promise than insulation. These walls worked in the fall. They failed in January. A single-width sod wall, one sod brick thick, roughly 18 inches, 46 centimeters, had decent thermal mass but almost no resistance to wind-driven cold. When the wind came from the northwest at 30 miles per hour for 3 days straight, it didn't just chill the air inside. It pulled heat directly from the wall surface through convection, stripping away whatever warmth the interior had stored overnight. Families woke to see their breath hanging in the air at 6 a.m., even with a fire burning. Frame cabins were worse. A single layer of 1-inch pine board and tar paper gave an insulation value that modern engineers would measure at roughly R1, barely above nothing. Heat moved through those walls like water through a cloth. A family burning could hold the interior at perhaps 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius on a still night. On a windy one, they were fighting to stay above freezing. Elias Warren knew this better than most. He'd spent 2 winters in a frame cabin before he buried his youngest daughter's toes, frostbitten past, saving on a February night when the fire went low. She survived. He didn't forget. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a carpenter by trade. He was a wheat farmer with a wagon, a team of horses, and a mind that didn't stop working problems just because everyone else had stopped caring. The following spring, he started reading. He'd gotten hold of a pamphlet, origin uncertain, possibly circulated by a German agricultural cooperative out of Nebraska, that described the insulating properties of densely packed straw. The pamphlet wasn't technical. It cited no experiments, but it said something Elias couldn't shake. Dead air, held still within dense fiber, resists the movement of heat more completely than any single solid material of equivalent thickness. Dead air, held still. He looked at the straw left from his harvest, hundreds of bales stacked in the field, worth almost nothing on a market that year, and he began to think about walls. Not walls as boundaries. Walls as storage. Walls as thermal batteries that could absorb the cold before it ever touched the family inside. His neighbors thought he was grieving in a strange direction. His brother-in-law, a practical man who'd built 3 cabins in his life, told him flatly, straw rots. Straw burns. Straw is for animals. Elias listened. He thanked him for the warning. Then he kept planning. Building a wall that breathed without leaking. The construction began in late summer of 1885, time so the structure would be complete and dry before the first frost. What Elias built was not complicated, but it violated almost every instinct that experienced builders on the prairie had developed, which is precisely why it made people angry. The foundation was stone, limestone slabs hauled from a dry creek bed 6 miles east. He laid them 2 courses high above grade, approximately 18 inches, 46 centimeters, above the ground surface. This was the first point of contention. Most cabins sat their sill logs directly on tamped earth or, at best, on a single flat stone. Elias raised his foundation deliberately, creating a gap between the wet ground and the base of his walls. His reasoning, moisture wicking upward from the soil, was the primary reason straw rotted in experimental structures he'd heard described. Keep the straw dry, keep it intact. The walls themselves were built using full wheat straw bales, each one approximately 36 inches long by 18 inches wide by 16 inches tall, 91 by 46 by 41 centimeters, weighing between 50 and 60 pounds, 23 to 27 kilograms, when dry. He stacked them flat, like oversized bricks, pinning each course to the one below using sharpened wooden stakes driven vertically through the bales. The bales were laid in a running bond, offset by half a bale per course, to prevent vertical seams that wind could exploit. The finished walls were 18 inches thick, 46 centimeters of densely packed straw, a material that, when compressed to baling density, traps millions of tiny air pockets within its fiber matrix. Heat cannot move quickly through still air. It has no medium to convect through, no direct solid path to conduct along. Modern thermal testing of comparable straw bale assemblies rates them at between R30 and R35 per wall assembly, compared to the R1 of Elias's old frame cabin. He didn't know those numbers, but he understood the principle. Dead air held still. The exterior was finished with a lime clay plaster, 2 coats, applied wet and smoothed with a wooden float. This served multiple purposes. It sealed the straw surface against wind penetration, shed rain, and created a hard shell that would resist casual fire risk far better than exposed straw. The interior walls received the same treatment. By the time both coats cured, the straw inside was locked between 2 continuous plaster shells, protected from moisture on both sides and from any ember that might escape the firebox. The roof was conventional, a low-pitch frame structure covered in split shingles. But Elias added one detail that drew particular ridicule. He packed loose straw between the ceiling joists to a depth of 14 inches, 35 centimeters, before laying the floorboards of the small loft above. 14 inches of loose straw above the living space acted as a secondary insulation layer, trapping the heat that naturally rose toward the ceiling before it could escape through the roof deck. The firebox itself was a corner-set cast iron stove, positioned in the northeast corner of the main room. Corner placement was deliberate. It allowed 2 walls to act as radiant reflectors, bouncing heat back into the room rather than losing it through a single exposed chimney wall. The stovepipe ran horizontally for 4 feet before turning vertical, a long horizontal run that allowed hot exhaust gases to surrender more of their heat to the room before exiting. It was a technique common in Russian-influenced stove design, adapted here with simpler materials. The total footprint of the structure was modest, approximately 16 by 20 feet for 0.9 by 6.1 meters. Small enough to heat with a single stove. Small enough that the thermal mass of the walls, Elias estimated he'd stacked close to 180 bales, could absorb and release heat over a full cycle of 12 to 16 hours. He had thought through ventilation. He had thought through fire clearances, keeping the stove at least 18 inches from any straw wall, the gap filled with a mortared stone panel. He had thought through drainage around the foundation. He had thought through maintenance access for the chimney. What he had not thought through, what he had genuinely failed to anticipate, was the reaction of the men who came to watch him build. A haystack dressed up as a house. The criticism didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated the way cold does, a degree at a time, until you suddenly realize you're in danger. The first comments were light. Men passing on the wagon road slowed their horses and leaned on the seat rail, watching Elias and his two older sons stack bales with the methodical patience of men who had committed to something. "What are you building, Elias?" "A fort for the field mice." That one got a laugh. He waved and kept stacking. By the time the walls were at window height, the commentary had sharpened. Word had reached town, as word always does in small communities, and now people were making a specific trip to have a look. Some came with genuine curiosity. Others came with their minds already made up. Harlan Pruitt arrived on a Thursday in early September. Pruitt was not a man anyone argued with lightly. He had been building structures on the Kansas prairie for going on 19 years. Sod houses, frame barns, a two-story mercantile in the county seat that still stood. He walked the perimeter of Elias's rising walls with the slow deliberation of a man performing a professional inspection, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing for a long while. When he finally spoke, it was not to Elias. It was to the small crowd that had gathered at the fence line. "Straw absorbs moisture," he said. "In 3 winters, the bottom courses will be black with mold and soft as a wet sponge. The plaster will crack. It always does, and when it does, the straw behind it will rot from the outside in. You won't see it happening. That's the danger. One day the wall will look fine, and the next day you'll lean against it and your hand will go through." He paused and looked at Elias directly. "I've seen men build with straw before. Out of desperation, mostly. It never ends well. This is a haystack dressed up as a house, and I say that without enjoyment." Nobody cheered. Nobody had to. The silence was its own verdict. A supplier named Dodd, who sold lumber and hardware from a yard near the rail depot, stopped by a week later and offered Elias a line of credit on proper framing lumber. It was a generous offer, and everyone watching understood the subtext. Even the man who profits from your failure is trying to save you from it. Elias thanked him, declined politely, and kept building. By October, the plaster was on and curing. The roof was framed and shingled. The stove was set. The family moved in on a clear, cold day in late October, the temperature at dusk reading 28 degrees Fahrenheit -2 degrees Celsius. And Elias fed a modest fire through the evening, watching the walls, watching the thermometer he'd hung near the door, watching for signs that Pruitt was right. The interior held at 61 degrees Fahrenheit 16 degrees Celsius that night. He used 11 pounds of wood. He said nothing about it to anyone. Then December arrived, and then January, and then, on the 14th of January, 1886, a storm came down from the north that locals would still be describing 40 years later. Wind sustained at 35 miles per hour. Snow horizontal. Temperatures that fell to -18 degrees Fahrenheit, -28 degrees Celsius, before the second morning. The kind of cold that makes cast iron brittle and turns exhaled breath to frost before it clears the lips. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that storm is the number that silenced Harlan Pruitt. Subscribe now, if you haven't, and hit the like button so more people can see what frontier engineering actually looked like when lives were on the line. What the thermometer said when no one was arguing on the third morning of the storm. Elias Wern's neighbor to the west, a man named Cyrus Beckwith, who had a well-built sod cabin and a full cord of oak stacked under a lean-to, walked the quarter-mile between their properties through knee-deep drifts to borrow a jar of lamp oil. His own fire had been burning continuously for 56 hours. He had consumed, by his own later accounting, nearly a full face cord, roughly 32 cubic feet of split oak, in 3 days. His interior temperature, measured with a small alcohol thermometer he kept on a shelf near the kitchen, had not climbed above 46 degrees Fahrenheit 8 degrees Celsius since the storm began. He'd kept his family in 2 rooms, hung quilts over the doorways, and burned wood at a rate that was starting to make him anxious about his remaining supply. When Cyrus knocked and Elias opened the door, the first thing Cyrus noticed was not the warmth, though the warmth hit him like stepping into a different season. The first thing he noticed was that Elias was not wearing a coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, in the middle of a blizzard. Cyrus stepped inside. He looked at the small cast iron stove in the corner, banked low, radiating gently. He looked at the thermometer on Elias's wall. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. He stood in silence for a moment, dripping snow on the packed earth floor. And then he said, "How much would have you burned?" Elias thought about it. About half a rick since it started. A half rick, roughly 16 cubic feet. In 3 days, against Cyrus's full face cord. Elias had burned approximately half the wood to maintain a temperature 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius warmer. The difference was not magic. It was physics, specifically the physics of thermal resistance and thermal mass working together. The straw bale walls, at an estimated R30 to R35, were resisting heat transfer at a rate 30 times greater than Cyrus's single-core sod. Every degree of temperature difference between inside and outside drives heat outward through the wall. That's conduction, and it's relentless. But conduction can only move as fast as the material allows. A thick, fiber-dense straw wall, sealed in plaster, slowed that movement to a crawl. The heat that Elias's small stove produced each evening didn't escape by morning. It lingered in the room, absorbed into the plaster, slowly given back as the fire faded. The 14 inches of loose straw above the ceiling joist played an equally critical role. Heat rises. Convection is predictable. And in most cabins, that rising heat hit the ceiling and transferred directly through the thin roof deck into the frozen air above. In Elias's structure, the risen heat met a 14-inch buffer of trapped air before it found anything solid to conduct through. It piled up effectively against a thermal ceiling and stayed inside. The corner stove placement amplified the effect. Rather than radiating heat in a single direction, the stove's output bounced off 2 plaster-covered stone panels, one on each interior corner wall, and distributed radiant heat across roughly 270 degrees of the room. The long horizontal stovepipe section extracted additional BTUs from exhaust gases before they exited, meaning that even the act of burning was more efficient. More heat captured per pound of wood, less wasted up the chimney. Oral accounts recorded by a county historical society in 1923, drawing on interviews with residents who had lived through the winter of 1886, describe the interior of Elias's cabin during the storm's peak as stubbornly warm, a phrase that appears in at least 3 separate testimonies. One account notes that a pot of water left on the floor near the door, the coldest point in any cabin, remained liquid throughout the storm, never approaching freezing. In Cyrus Beckwith's cabin, the same pot would have needed to sit within 3 feet of the stove to avoid icing over by morning. By the storm's 5th day, Elias had burned through roughly 3/4 of a rick. His interior temperature had not dropped below 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius at any point. Even on the second night, when the wind peaked and the temperature outside bottomed at minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius, a difference of 80 degrees, 44 degrees Celsius between inside and out. His stove had been banked, running at reduced output, for 6 of the storm's longest hours. Cyrus had burned through nearly 2 full face cords. His lowest recorded interior temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. When the storm broke on the 6th day and the sun returned, Cyrus walked home with his jar of lamp oil, which Elias had given him without being asked, and told his wife what he had seen. She asked him what they were going to do about their own cabin. He said he was going to go talk to Elias. When foolish becomes the new standard, the storm of January 1886 did not end arguments on the Saline River settlement. Arguments on the prairie rarely ended cleanly, but it did something more lasting than settling a debate. It shifted the weight of evidence so completely that the debate became, over time, embarrassing to continue. Cyrus Beckwith was the first. He came to Elias 3 days after the storm broke, hat in hand, asking not for charity, but for instruction. He wanted to know exactly what had been done, in what order and why. Elias walked him through it at the kitchen table. The foundation height, the bale orientation, the The lime-clay mixed proportions, the stovepipe horizontal run, the ceiling pack. Cyrus listened the way a man listens when he knows the information is worth more than his pride. He began modifying his sod cabin the following spring. He couldn't afford to rebuild from scratch, so he did what practical men have always done. He adapted. He built a secondary straw bale wall against the north and west faces of his existing structure, the two faces that bore the worst of the prevailing winter wind, and plastered them in. He packed loose straw above his ceiling joist to a depth of 10 inches, 25 centimeters, which was what he had available. He repositioned his stove to a corner and extended his stovepipe run by 3 feet before the vertical turn. The following winter, by his own accounting, he burned roughly 30% less wood and held his interior temperature an average of 11 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius warmer than the year before. It wasn't Elias's 22 degrees, but it was measurable, repeatable, and real, and it cost him almost nothing beyond labor. Word traveled the way useful information travels in isolated communities, not through announcements, but through observation. A man notices his neighbor's woodpile shrinking slower than his own. He asks why. The answer leads him to Elias's door, or to Cyrus's modified sod wall, or to a third neighbor who had heard the story secondhand and built his own interpretation. By the winter of 1887, local accounts suggest that at least 9 structures within a 12-mile radius of Elias's property had incorporated some version of straw bale insulation, either as full wall systems or as supplemental exterior wrapping on existing construction. None of them were identical. The prairie demanded improvisation. Some used partial bale depths. Some skipped the lime plaster and used a clay-straw mixture instead, a technique with its own long history in Central European vernacular building. One family built a straw-insulated root cellar access tunnel that kept their winter vegetable stores from freezing for the first time in 4 years. The technique spread not because it was fashionable, but because it worked when the alternative was cold children and an empty woodpile. Harlan Pruitt, the builder who had stood the fence line and delivered his verdict to an audience, did not come to Elias directly. That would have required a kind of public reversal that men of his standing rarely managed gracefully. But oral account from a 1923 Historical Society survey include a telling detail. By 1888, Pruitt had begun recommending raised limestone foundations to his clients as a standard practice. By 1890, he was specifying packed straw ceiling insulation in 2 structures he built near the county seat. He never mentioned Elias Wern by name in any recorded conversation. He didn't need to. The ideas had already outlived the argument. What Elias understood, what he had worked out from a poorly printed pamphlet and a grief he never stopped carrying, was something that builders in colder climates across the world had been practicing for centuries without calling it engineering. The Inuit packed snow into their kajak frames not because snow was warm, but because its cellular structure trapped dead air and stopped wind penetration. The same principle, in different material, at a different scale. Scandinavian farmers packed their timber-framed bank barns into hillsides so that the earth itself became a thermal mass, absorbing the cold on the outside and releasing warmth on the inside. Mongolian herders layered felt over their girth frames, compressed animal fiber, holding still air in millions of tiny pockets, and moved those structures across a landscape that could kill an unprotected man in under an hour. None of these people called it R-value. None of them had calculated thermal conductivity coefficients. But all of them understood, through hard-won generations of observation, that the goal was not to fight the cold directly. That battle is always lost, but to slow it. To build a buffer between the living body and the killing air that was deep enough, dense enough, and sealed enough to give the fire time to do its work. Elias Wern built that buffer out of what the prairie gave him. Wheat straw, a harvest byproduct worth almost nothing on the market, stacked in the field waiting to decompose, became, in his hands, a thermal system that outperformed every conventionally built structure in his community during the worst winter in a decade. He did not patent the idea. He did not write it down. He answered every question his neighbors brought to him and charged nothing for the answers. The knowledge spread the way frontier knowledge has always spread, person to person, winter to winter, modified by each pair of hands that touched it. By 1890, straw bale construction had been formally documented in a Nebraska agricultural bulletin as a viable building method for treeless prairie regions. The bulletin cited no individual inventor. It described the method as having emerged organically from settler practice, which is perhaps the most accurate thing that could be said about it. It had not emerged from a laboratory or a university. It had emerged from a man who lost part of his daughter to a cold night and refused to lose anything else. The straw fortress stood for at least 31 years. County land records from 1917 show the property still registered to the Warren family, with the original structure listed as the primary dwelling. A notation in the margin of 1912 property assessment, handwritten, source uncertain, reads, walls sound, no rot evident, plaster intact. 27 years in, standing in the Kansas wind, warm inside. The lesson Elias Warren left on the Saline River is not simply that straw is a good insulator, though it is. It is not simply that dead air slows heat transfer, though it does. The deeper lesson is about the relationship between observation and arrogance, about who gets to decide what counts as valid knowledge and what gets dismissed before it's tested. Harlan Pruitt had 19 years of building experience and a reputation that filled a room. He was not a stupid man. He was a man whose experience had become, without his realizing it, a boundary, a perimeter inside which new information had to fit or be rejected. He looked at straw bales stacked into walls, and he saw everything that could go wrong, because his knowledge was built from everything that had gone wrong before. Elias had no such boundary. He had a pamphlet, a pile of straw, and a cold he would not accept. That is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about every unconventional idea sitting on the fence line of someone else's expertise, waiting to be laughed at or tested. The ones worth keeping survive the winter. If this story made you think differently about how we build, or how we dismiss what we don't understand, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and the coldest winter you've ever lived through. There are people watching this right now in places Elias Warren never heard of, facing versions of the same problem he faced. Too much cold, too little fuel, and a system that isn't quite working. The old answers are still out there. Subscribe so you don't miss them, because next week we're going inside another structure that was called primitive until it outperformed everything around it. The frontier never ran out of ideas. It just ran out of people willing to write them down. This script is intended for educational and historical storytelling purposes. Straw bale construction involves specific engineering, fire safety, moisture management, and building code considerations that vary by jurisdiction. Always consult qualified professionals before undertaking any construction project.